Since she cannot even afford a cheap public defender, I suggest we expedite this summary judgment. My father laughed, his deep voice echoing loudly through the crowded federal courtroom. His elite legal team of $1,000 an hour corporate attorneys smirked confidently, assuming I was about to be crushed. I stood there alone at the wooden defendant table, wearing a simple, inexpensive charcoal gray blazer. I just waited silently for the federal judge to look up at the digital projection screen I had just activated. When she finally did, the entire sprawling courtroom went completely, terrifyingly dead silent. The judge slowly turned her stern gaze to my father's incredibly pale lead attorney and said, "She will absolutely not be needing a lawyer, counselor. But I highly suggest you hire one for yourself immediately." The lead attorney went completely white and literally dropped his expensive gold pen onto the floor. He stammered, his hands visibly shaking. "Oh my God. Look at that signature." My father's knees actually violently buckled. He aggressively grabbed the sharp edge of the wooden witness stand to keep from collapsing and whispered a specific name he thought was violently buried forever. "Victoria, I am Gwen. Before I tell you how I surgically brought down my father's $1.2 billion tech and real estate empire with a single redacted piece of paper, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing people get what they deserve by their own greedy hands." Growing up in the affluent, exclusive suburbs of Chicago, our family projected an image of untouchable perfection. My father, Edward, was the ruthless CEO of a diversified real estate and technology investment fund. Our childhood home was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate, featuring imported marble floors, soaring vaulted ceilings, and a circular driveway permanently filled with leased European luxury cars. But behind those heavy custom-built oak doors, the atmosphere was completely suffocating. I was always considered the ultimate family disappointment. While my father valued ruthless ambition and my stepmother, Catherine, valued shameless, cutthroat social climbing, I was quiet, analytical, and fiercely independent. I chose to build a lucrative career specifically tracking down hidden offshore money, unmasking corporate fraud, and auditing global financial datasets. To them, I was just a boring, pathetic number cruncher who lacked the family's supposed visionary, elite spirit. My younger sister, Vanessa, on the absolute other hand, was the flawless golden child. At 29 years old, she held a meaningless, inflated title as the vice president of global communications at my father's company. It was a fake corporate role that mostly consisted of posting curated, filtered photos on social media and spending her unearned salary on limited edition designer bags. She could do no wrong. Her elevated status in the toxic family hierarchy was further cemented in stone when she married Trey. Trey was 34, a brilliantly slick, charismatic financial advisor who had charmed his way right to the top of my father's elite inner circle. With his expensive custom-tailored suits, a gold Rolex, and a smile that could easily sell ice to an Eskimo, Trey had rapidly become my father's most trusted, influential confidant. He managed the family office and exclusively handled all the private offshore accounts, constantly throwing around complex Wall Street jargon that made my father feel like a financial king. The massive, coordinated betrayal that completely shattered my life aggressively happened on a brutally freezing Thursday evening late in November. It was Thanksgiving. A roasted turkey sat in the center of the long mahogany table, surrounded by expensive crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and elaborate towering autumn floral arrangements. But inside, the stone fireplace roared warmly, casting a soft, golden glow over the smiling faces of the people who were about to attempt to destroy my life. We had just finished the massive main course when the heavy tension in the formal room suddenly, violently shifted. My father stood up slowly at the head of the long mahogany table. The sharp, piercing clinkings and sound cut violently through the soft, ambient classical background music. He smoothly adjusted the wide lapels of his incredibly expensive tailored jacket and looked aggressively down the entire length of the table. "I want to take a very important moment to give profound thanks for the future of this family," my father began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he reserved for hostile corporate board meetings. To stay on top, our investment fund requires immediate restructuring. We need fresh capital, sharp minds, and uncompromising dedication to our core growth strategies. I took a slow, calculated sip of my ice water, feeling a very familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Whenever my father talked about corporate strategy at the family dinner table, he was usually preparing to publicly insult someone. I have spent the last few intensive weeks reviewing our trust allocations and the legal structure of the family office, he continued, his cold eyes drifting past Vanessa and landing squarely on me. The future of this empire relies solely on those who build it and generate real, tangible value. Therefore, effective immediately, I am legally dissolving Gwen's 30% allocation in the family trust. The brutal words hit me exactly like a massive physical blow. I stopped breathing. 30% was my legal inheritance, the portion of the family trust set up years ago to definitively ensure my financial future security. He kept his cold, red eyes firmly locked on mine as he delivered the rest of the devastating sentence. That 30% financial allocation is being immediately transferred to Vanessa and Trey to expand their investment portfolios and reward their ongoing value to the parent company, my father stated coldly. My silver fork slipped from my numb fingers and clattered loudly against my expensive porcelain plate. The sharp, jarring sound echoed in the sudden silence of the formal dining room. I looked around the table, desperately waiting for someone to say this was a cruel, inappropriate holiday joke. Instead, I saw Vanessa trying and failing to hide a triumphant smirk. She took a delicate, calculated sip of her expensive red wine, her eyes sparkling with malicious joy right over the crystal rim of her glass. Catherine, my manipulative stepmother, placed a manicured hand over her heart and put on a mask of fake, exaggerated sympathy. She leaned forward slightly, looking at me with unfiltered pity. "It really is for the best, Gwen," Catherine said smoothly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You have your little boring accounting job, and you live such a very simple, pathetic life in your tiny downtown apartment. You have to understand that crucial family resources must be prioritized for critical family growth." I sat there, completely stunned. They were stealing my inheritance right in front of my face, casually discussing my financial ruin over expensive cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. My own father had just stripped away my financial security, without a single fleeting second thought, treating my future like a bad investment he was writing off his corporate taxes. Before I could even actively find the precise words to heavily defend myself, Trey shifted confidently in his expensive chair. He reached down into the designer leather briefcase, resting right by his expensive shoes. He smoothly pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, printed on premium, expensive watermarked paper. The crisp white pages contrasted sharply with the dark mahogany wood of the formal dining table. Trey gave me a practiced, sympathetic smile that did not reach his dead, calculating eyes. He smoothly slid the legal document across the long table until it stopped right next to my expensive plate. We went ahead and had the elite legal team draft the formal voluntary forfeit agreement, Trey said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Since the corporate restructuring is happening by the end of the fiscal quarter, we need to expedite the legal process to maximize tax efficiency. It will save everyone a lot of unnecessary legal friction and allow the family to easily move forward." I stared aggressively down at the incredibly bold, heavy black letters printed clearly at the absolute top of the page. Voluntary forfeit of trust allocation. They did not just want to take my money, they wanted me to hand it over willingly. They wanted me to surrender. I slowly, deliberately pushed my chair back from the long table. The mahogany scraped against the imported marble floor, causing a harsh, grating noise that made Catherine wince. I did not reach for the expensive customized gold pen Trey had so helpfully placed beside the legal document. Instead, I heavily picked up the thick, massive stack of paper and aggressively began to actively read. I did not just quickly skim the bold headings. I meticulously read the fine print. Lucrative career is built on finding the lies hiding in the margins, the quiet deceptions buried in paragraph 14 of a supposedly standard legal contract. My sharp eyes rapidly scanned the asset transfer clauses. They were attempting to reallocate my 30% legal stake into a very specific leveraged holding company. It was the same blind shell entity Trey had set up 8 months ago to manage a leveraged, risky commercial real estate acquisition downtown. I set the document down. I looked at Trey. He was maintaining his polished smile, but a tiny muscle near his sharp jaw was twitching. "You are not restructuring for tax efficiency, Trey," I said, keeping my voice flat. "You are trying to illegally plug a hole in your ruined liquidity." The highly polished smile completely vanished from Trey's face in less than a second. "Excuse me?" Trey spat, his voice dropping the artificial warmth entirely. I leaned aggressively forward, heavily tapping my index finger directly against the specific asset transfer clause in the contract. "The South Loop commercial project you acquired last spring is severely underwater," I stated clearly, my voice cutting through the silence of the dining room. "Commercial lease rates have plummeted, and your crucial anchor tenant filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 2 weeks ago. The real estate fund is bleeding amounts of liquid cash, and you need my 30% trust allocation to cover your terrible investments before the portfolio collapses." A heavily suffocating, deeply silence instantly dropped completely over the formal dining room. My father's face darkened, a dangerous, furious red flush creeping up his thick neck. Catherine stopped pretending to look sympathetic and simply stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. Trey let out a harsh, barking laugh. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, his posture shifting from relaxed, fake confidence to intimidation. He leaned across the mahogany table, towering over the expensive centerpiece. "That is why you will never understand level capital management, Gwen," Trey sneered, launching into a rapid-fire barrage of Wall Street jargon designed to confuse and belittle me. "You are talking about minor short-term liquidity gaps, but you cannot mentally grasp the macro strategy. You normalize the EBITDA over a 5-year projected yield, and the debt-to-equity ratio aligns with our mezzanine financing covenants." He pointed a long, incredibly accusatory finger directly at my face. "You look at the dead past, Gwen," Trey spat. "You do not have the mental capacity to comprehend the global growth metrics required to keep this powerful family at the top of the global food chain. You are just a boring, pathetic auditor who panics the second a portfolio takes a calculated, strategic dip." Before I could even dismantle his ridiculous word salad, Vanessa jumped into the vicious fray. She slammed her manicured hand onto the mahogany table, her diamond engagement ring catching the expensive chandelier light. "God, you are so embarrassing, Gwen," Vanessa scoffed, her tone dripping with unfiltered disgust. "You sit in your tiny, depressing apartment, wearing your cheap gray suits, and you judge powerful people who actually take financial risks. You are 33 years old, single and utterly invisible." Vanessa picked up her crystal wine glass, swirling the dark liquid as she looked me up and down like I was a pathetic piece of trash that had just blown in from the freezing street. "You are a parasite, Gwen," Vanessa sneered. "You drain the family resources without contributing a single, solitary thing of actual value. You just exist, leeching off the trust fund Dad built, and now you have the nerve to sit here and insult my brilliant husband." I kept my expression blank, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I looked away from my raging sister and locked cold eyes with the man orchestrating this financial theft. "You can dress it up in all the corporate buzzwords you want, Trey," I stated coldly. "You made a disastrous gamble, and now you are trying to steal my legal inheritance to save yourself from a devastating margin call." "Not ever." The incredibly air in the formal room completely seemed to instantly vanish. My father violently stood up. He did not just actively stand, he heavily erupted. He brought both of his fists crashing down onto the mahogany dining table with truly terrifying, unhinged force. The expensive crystal wine glasses shook, spilling red stains across the pristine white tablecloth. The expensive silver cutlery rattled against the porcelain plates. "How dare you?" my father roared, his voice thunderous and shaking with uncontrollable fury. "How dare you sit at my expensive table, eat my expensive food, and question the intellect of the brilliant man saving this powerful family? You have been nothing but a miserable, ungrateful, pathetic disappointment, since the day you were unfortunately born. My father's face was a terrifying mask of pure, unfiltered rage. It smashed against the stone fireplace, immediately exploding into 100 glittering, jagged shards. Dark red wine splashed across the cold gray hearth, looking like fresh blood. He marched around the edge of the long dining table, his footsteps echoing off the soaring vaulted ceilings. Every single step he took was specifically designed to intimidate, to dominate, and to force me into pathetic submission. He pointed a heavily shaking, incredibly finger completely toward Vanessa. "Look at your brilliant sister," he sneered, his booming voice vibrating with pure venom. "You are a bitterly lonely, pathetic little accountant who contributes zero to the global empire I built with my own bare hands. You just audit other powerful people's money because you have no true vision to create your own." He used Trey as the shield and the sword, ignoring the fact that Trey was sinking his prized, leveraged real estate fund into the ground. Trey sat back in his expensive chair, smoothing his expensive silk tie, looking satisfied with the monster he had just unleashed. I stood my ground, my numb hands trembling slightly at my sides, though I forced my posture to remain straight. I refused to let them see me break. I refused to give my father the satisfaction of a single pathetic tear. My father checked his gold Rolex watch, his booming tone dropping to a deadly icy register. "You have 5 tight minutes to get off my property, or I will have you physically thrown out like the pathetic trespasser you actually are." Right on orchestrated cue, Catherine buried her made-up face in her manicured hands. She let out a loud, theatrical, pathetic sob that echoed through the tense dining room. "Gwen, how could you do this?" Catherine cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured, fake heartbreak. "On Thanksgiving of all important days, you are destroying this family. We only ever tried to love you, and you just want to tear us apart out of pure jealousy." She clung to my father's rigid arm, playing the devastated, pathetic matriarch. I looked over at Vanessa, who was casually dabbing the very corners of her mouth with an expensive linen napkin, unbothered by her mother's fake performance. The display was sickening. It was a orchestrated psychological attack, specifically designed to make me feel isolated, crazy, and at fault for my own robbery. My father did absolutely not actually wait the entire full 5 minutes. He snapped his fingers toward the hallway. Instantly, 2 of his private security contractors stepped into the formal dining room. These were muscular men wearing dark suits, the kind of ruthless muscle he hired to keep the press away during his corporate hostile acquisitions. "Escort her out," my father ordered, turning his broad back on me. I did not let the security guards touch me. I picked up my thin gray winter coat and my simple purse. Holding my head, I walked past the shattered, jagged glass on the floor, past the lavish Thanksgiving feast that was now going cold, and walked out the front oak doors. The moment I crossed the threshold, the bitter, Chicago winter hit me like a solid brick wall. The freezing, sharp winter wind bit right through my thin, pathetic gray blazer. The security guards stood silently at the grand entrance, their muscular arms crossed, watching me walk down the long, icy cobblestone driveway. My cheap heels slipped slightly on the frosted pavement, but I forced myself to walk with dignity. Behind me, the oak doors slammed shut with a definitive thud, sealing me out in the dark, freezing winter night. I reached my modest, practical sedan and quickly slid into the freezing driver's seat. My freezing hands were shaking now, a mixture of rapidly fading adrenaline, profound shock, and the freezing temperature dropping the freezing air inside the cold cabin. I turned on the loud engine, blasting the car's heater to stop my freezing teeth from chattering. Not with my father's threats hanging over my head and Trey's unpredictable malice. I needed to find a quiet, cheap motel downtown where I could regroup, analyze the specific financial data I had mentally cataloged at the dinner table, and plan my legal defense against Trey's blatant corporate theft. I pulled out my smartphone, intending to book a cheap, anonymous room for the freezing night. I quickly opened my secure primary banking application to check my available checking balance. The bright screen glowed in the dark car, the small, annoying loading circle spun for a few tight seconds. I waited, breathing into my freezing, cupped hands. Suddenly, the highly glowing screen aggressively flashed completely bright. A bold, glaring red banner appeared across the top of my phone. I blinked, assuming it was a poor weak network connection or a standard routine system error. I refreshed the page. The same terrifying message remained glaring back at me in harsh, red letters. Account completely frozen. Panic began to claw at my freezing chest. My freezing breath caught in my dry throat. I quickly opened my secure secondary banking application. The specific one tied and to my private personal savings, separate from the family trust. I logged in with frantic, clumsy fingers. The bright screen slowly loaded, account completely frozen. I pulled out my emergency expensive credit card, flipped the secure app open, and checked the status online. Access aggressively denied. The brutal, suffocating reality of my situation crashed down on me all at once. My father and Trey did not just kick me out into the freezing, dangerous snow. They had already weaponized the legal power of the family office against me. Utilizing a predatory corporate compliance loophole, Trey had likely classified all my private personal accounts as commingled family trust assets, triggering an immediate lockdown under the guise of an internal security review. I was sitting trapped in a freezing cold car in the middle of a brutal Chicago winter night. I had no access to my secure savings, no functioning secure credit cards, and no cash in my wallet. I was isolated, locked out of my own life, and utterly broke. My freezing breath plumed in the frigid cabin air as the brutal reality of their strategy clicked into place. This was not a temporary bank glitch or a simple administrative error. As a skilled global financial data architect, I recognized the legal mechanism Trey had triggered. Managing the family office gave him sweeping, administrative oversight of all connected capital. By drafting a bogus, fake internal audit report claiming my private personal checking accounts were illegally commingled with trust assets, he had weaponized elite banking compliance laws against me. He had initiated a mandatory security review under financial regulations. The global banks were legally obligated to freeze every single asset bearing my secure social security number until the investigation concluded. A fake investigation Trey himself would drag out for long months. It was in textbook, corporate siege. Without liquid capital, I could not hire an corporate lawyer. Without an expensive lawyer, I could not fight the forfeit of my inheritance. But Trey made one critical miscalculation. He assumed I operated with the same reckless arrogance he did. He assumed I kept all my valuable assets visible on the grid. I reached into the freezing glove compartment, pulled out a metal flashlight, and popped the cold trunk release. Stepping out into the biting, freezing wind, I walked to the back of the freezing sedan and lifted the floor panel covering the spare tire. Taped tightly to the freezing underside of the rubber mat was a secure, waterproof plastic pouch. Inside was a loaded prepaid corporate expense card I had set up 3 years ago using a separate offshore business entity one I used for independent, secure off-the-books global audit trips. It was detached from the family office tracking software. It held exactly $2,000. It was not nearly enough to fight a billionaire in federal court, but it was enough to survive the freezing night. I slammed the freezing trunk shut, got back into the freezing driver's seat, and put the freezing car in gear. I drove fast away from the manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs, heading into the dark, industrial outskirts of the city. I needed a cheap place that asked 0 questions and required no formal credit checks. 20 tight minutes later, I pulled into the flickering neon glow of a rundown, sketchy motel off the interstate. The bored receptionist behind the thick, scratched security glass barely glanced at me as she swiped my prepaid card and slid a cheap, brass key through the freezing metal slot. Room 112. The room smelled of harsh industrial bleach and stale cigarette smoke. A single, bare overhead bulb illuminated peeling yellow wallpaper, and a cheap television bolted to the wooden dresser. I locked the flimsy deadbolt, slid the metal chain into place, and sat down on the sharp edge of the lumpy, sunken cheap mattress. The old metal springs groaned loudly under my weight. I kept my thin winter coat on, wrapping my freezing arms tightly around my shivering waist to stop the intense physical shaking. I needed to clearly think. I needed to carefully map out a corporate counter-offensive. Just as my freezing brain started running through the potential legal avenues to unfreeze my accounts, my secure smartphone suddenly chimed loudly. The sharp, cheerful ping sounded, utterly absurd in the grim silence of the freezing motel room. I pulled the freezing device from my cold pocket, expecting a gloating text message from Vanessa. Instead, it was an urgent email marked with intense priority red flags. I quickly checked the sender domain, and my freezing blood ran, utterly cold. It was from the powerful senior managing partner at my father's elite, ruthless corporate law firm. The very same cutthroat legal sharks he used to mercilessly crush his business rivals into dust. My freezing thumb hovered over the glowing screen. I tapped the message open. Attached was a thick PDF legal document bearing the official, blue seal of the Federal District Court. My trained eyes scanned the harsh, complex legal jargon, parsing the phrasing with intense practice speed. It was not just a formal notice of disinheritance. A simple disinheritance would require a lengthy legal probate process, giving me tight time to legally challenge the forfeit. This was an immediate rim and calculated strike designed to obliterate me into dust. I read the bold, capitalized header of the legal complaint. It was a huge civil lawsuit filed against me personally. The charge was not simple breach of standard contract. The charge was not basic insubordination. The charge was corporate espionage and theft of elite trade secrets. My freezing heart hammered against my freezing ribs. Trey had taken my accurate assessment of his failing real estate portfolio at the formal Thanksgiving dinner table and spun it into a malicious weapon. The lawsuit alleged that I had illegally hacked into the secure family office's servers to steal confidential financial data. They were claiming my knowledge of the impending margin calls on the huge South Loop project was the result of a deliberate, malicious cyber attack rather than basic financial accounting deduction. By filing this fabricated lawsuit, my father was demanding hundreds of millions of dollars in punishing punitive damages. If I lost, I would not just lose my rightful inheritance. I would be buried in corporate debt for the rest of my pathetic life. Furthermore, a pending lawsuit for corporate espionage would instantly trigger an red flag in my professional industry. No elite forensic accounting firm in the country would ever hire an elite senior auditor accused of stealing client data. I would instantly become professionally radioactive. It was a calculated, lethal strike meant to ensure I could never work as an elite global tech auditor ever again. They did not just want to take my money, they wanted to destroy my clean, elite professional name, bankrupt my future, and leave me with nothing but a mountain of corporate debt. I spent the terrifying rest of the freezing weekend trapped in that dingy, poorly heated motel room, existing on terrible diner coffee and sheer raw adrenaline. I refused to let the panic consume me. I meticulously, systematically organized my thoughts, drafting mental counter-strategies and listing every single level contact I had in the elite legal sector. I convinced myself that no matter how hard Edward and Trey tried to squeeze me financially, I still possessed one untouchable asset: my lucrative career. I was a skilled, respected global tech auditor at one of the most prestigious firms in downtown Chicago. I had a flawless track record and six-figure salary and the trust of the senior corporate partners. I could fight back. Over the freezing next 48 hours, I operated on pure, unadulterated desperation. I used the last remaining funds on my hidden prepaid card to travel across the freezing city, securing emergency legal consultations with 3 different defense attorneys. I specifically targeted top-tier corporate litigators, the kind of ruthless lawyers who built their careers fighting complex financial disputes. The exact first massive meeting lasted exactly 12 tight minutes. I sat in a sleek, expensive glass-walled office across from a sharp-suited litigator. He reviewed the initial federal complaint, closely noting the severity of the corporate espionage charges. He leaned forward, visibly intrigued by the case, and asked for a $75,000 retainer to begin formal legal discovery. I maintained my composure as I explained that all my personal and joint assets had been maliciously frozen by the plaintiff under predatory banking compliance laws. I asked if his expensive firm would take the case on a contingency basis. The expensive lawyer's professional smile vanished instantly. He stood up, handed the legal complaint back to me, and politely but firmly showed me to the glass door. The second tense consultation was with a connected, mid-level corporate defense attorney. He listened to my summary of the Thanksgiving dinner, taking diligent notes. He seemed ready to mount a defense until I revealed the specific name of the plaintiff. The moment I spoke my father's name and mentioned his $1.2 billion real estate investment fund, the expensive attorney dropped his gold pen. He went pale. He explained that his elite firm occasionally handled subcontracted title work specifically for my father's huge holding companies. He cited a conflict of legal interest and practically sprinted out of his own expensive conference room. My final hope was a gritty lawyer known specifically for taking on impossible underdog cases. I sat in his cramped, paper-filled office, laying out the mechanics of Trey's margin calls and the resulting asset freeze. The tough lawyer rubbed his jaw, letting out a long sigh. He looked at me with genuine pity. He explained the brutal reality of the American legal system. My father's elite legal team would drown us in endless motions, relentless discovery requests, and procedural delays. Without a liquid war chest to fund the battle, it was financial suicide for any single law firm to take the case. The system was pay to play, and my father had deliberately disconnected my financial controller. The lawyer apologized and refused the case. I walked out of the third expensive law office, the brutally freezing Chicago wind stinging my numb face. The sheer, terrifying perfection of Trey's trap settled over me. I was blocked from the legal system. I had no money, no lawyer, and no hope of fighting back inside a standard, expensive federal courtroom. They had cut off my social support system, ensuring that no single person would listen to my side of the story. Anyone I tried to contact would view my defense as the frantic rambling of a guilty, desperate woman trapped. I spent the rest of the brutal weekend trapped inside that dingy, freezing motel room, existing on terrible diner coffee and sheer unadulterated survival adrenaline. I meticulously organized my thoughts, drafting mental counter-strategies and listing every single level contact I had in the elite legal sector. Monday morning finally arrived with a brutal, biting frost. I put on my sharpest charcoal gray suit, the armor I had worn to successfully dismantle dozens of corporate frauds. I took the freezing subway into the financial district, clutching my briefcase tightly. I walked through the massive revolving doors of my elite firm and approached the stainless steel security turnstiles. I pulled my corporate identification badge from my heavy coat pocket and actively tapped it against the scanner. A sharp negative buzz sounded, the small screen flashed violently red, access restricted. Before I could even walk over to the security desk, a hand fell on my shoulder. I turned to see the head of building security, flanked by 2 guards. He politely but firmly escorted me to the human resources department on the ground floor. I was led into a sterile, windowless conference room. Sitting entirely across the long table was the director of human resources, alongside Mr. Bradley, the senior managing partner of my massive division. I recognized the document lying on top immediately. It was the same lawsuit complaint my father's legal team had emailed me. We received a highly concerning phone call late last night, Gwen, Mr. He informed us that you are currently the primary defendant in a massive corporate espionage lawsuit. Effective immediately, you are placed on an indefinite, unpaid administrative suspension pending the absolute resolution of these massive federal charges. Trey had expertly dismantled my entire professional reputation in less than 48 hours. I was handed a standard cardboard box and instructed to pack my personal belongings, while a junior HR representative watched my every single move. The security guards escorted me out the front doors, dumping me back onto the freezing pavement of the financial district. I checked my phone and saw what else Vanessa had done. She had orchestrated a vicious smear campaign across social media, falsely framing my lawsuit as the tragic action of an unhinged, greedy relative trying to extort her own blood. My social circle abandoned me. By freezing Thursday evening, my prepaid card was empty. I had to risk returning to my apartment downtown. I desperately needed my winter coats and whatever expensive jewelry I could gather to pawn for cash. I navigated the familiar, carpeted hallway of my residential building. I turned the corner and actively approached my front door, stopping dead exactly in my tracks. Taped directly over the deadbolt was a bright, glaring yellow piece of paper. Expedited notice of eviction. My father's real estate fund owned a stake in the management company. Trey had leveraged the fake cybercrime investigation to trigger an immediate lockout. I called the corrupt building manager, citing specific tenant law, and forced him to grant me a supervised 2-hour window to retrieve my critical personal effects. I stripped the massive apartment down to its exact bare bones, working with frantic, highly mechanical speed. I finally reached the very back of my deep walk-in closet. Sitting in the darkest, heaviest corner, buried under a layer of thick dust, were 3 cardboard boxes sealed with brittle packing tape. I immediately recognized the faded handwriting. Linda Victoria. They were my biological mother's belongings. I grabbed the top box. The old cardboard was compromised by years of storage and the bottom gave out. A cascade of items crashed onto the closet floor: faded photographs, old spiral-bound planners, and stacks of yellowed bank statements spilled across the hardwood. As I reached desperately under a pile of loose, faded receipts, my fingers brushed against something thick and I pulled it completely out. It was a dark green leather-bound accounting ledger. The spine was cracked and worn from use. The gold foil stamping on the cover read, Financials 1998 to 2001. Those were the years my father supposedly built his real estate empire from the ground up. I flipped the heavy leather cover completely open. Columns of financial data were blacked out with a thick, permanent marker. Someone had gone through the ledger page by page, redacting sections of financial history. But whoever did it was an amateur. They did not understand how an elite forensic accountant reads financial ghosts. I quickly stood up and carried the ledger out into the harsh bright light of my kitchen. I held the thick paper up to the bright overhead bulb. The intense backlight cut right through the cheap black marker, revealing the raw, unaltered numbers bleeding through the cheap ink. My father had always told the financial press that he secured his initial capital through a leveraged loan from an anonymous private equity group. But the numbers staring back at me underneath the black ink told a different story. There was absolutely no private equity loan. There was a liquid cash injection of $12 million. The account owner was not a corporate bank. The sole proprietor of the $12 million was Linda Victoria. And he had buried her financial footprint in cheap black ink. Fast forward directly to exactly today. Since she cannot even afford a cheap public defender, I suggest we expedite this easy summary judgment. My father laughed, his voice echoing loudly through the crowded federal courtroom. His elite legal team smirked, assuming I was about to be crushed. I stood there alone at the defendant table. I did not say a single word. I just waited for the federal judge to look up at the projection screen. When she finally did, she heavily turned to my father's incredibly pale lead attorney. She will not be heavily needing a lawyer, but I suggest you hire one immediately. My father's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the wooden stand and whispered a specific name he thought was buried forever. Victoria. My biological mother, Linda Victoria, founded this holding company with $12 million of her own capital, I stated, my amplified voice cutting through the silent courtroom. My father forged the asset transfer documents upon her death. But my brilliant mother anticipated his greed. She hid an obscure, airtight foundational clause within the original holding company charter. I heavily tapped a single key on my heavy laptop, changing the massive projection. The clause dictates that if any fraudulent tampering is discovered regarding the foundational assets, 100% of the holding company, immediately, and defaults to the sole biological heir upon their 33rd birthday. Trey's heavily polished face turned a deeply terrifying shade of gray. I turned 33 3 weeks ago, I said, my voice ringing with icy finality. Which legally means I do not just own my stolen 30% trust allocation. The margin calls Trey desperately tried to cover, using my stolen money, have already been defaulted. And since Trey committed federal wire fraud to hide the corporate deficits, the FBI is waiting outside those courtroom doors. Catherine let out a unhinged theatrical scream as the crushing reality hit her. She was broke. Trey tried to sprint out the side doors, but federal marshals tackled him to the hard courtroom floor, snapping cold steel handcuffs onto his shaking wrists. My father collapsed into his expensive chair, a broken, ruined shell of a man who had nothing left. I smoothly closed my silver laptop, packed it into my leather briefcase, and walked out of the federal courtroom. I left them all drowning in the ruins of their lies, while I walked away with my billion-dollar empire. Let me know what you think of this story in the comments below. Drop a like and subscribe for more stories of calculated revenge.